He was the voice of heartbreak, the man who could pour an ocean of sorrow into a single note. George Jones didn't just sing country music. He embodied it, lived it, and nearly destroyed himself with it. His career was defined by timeless songs and unforgettable performances, but behind the curtain, Jones carried a storm that few dared to acknowledge. Resentments, betrayals, quiet rivalries that ate at him for decades. For years, he held his tongue, choosing whiskey and silence over confrontation. But when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed a shocking list of names: fellow singers, producers, even his own wife, who left scars he never forgot. These are the 7 people George Jones secretly couldn't stand. And the stories you're about to hear will forever change the way you see the man they called the Possum. The story of George Jones and Johnny Paycheck wasn't one of rivalry. It was a tragic bond between 2 men cut from the same cloth, each chasing fame and each nearly destroyed by it. Paycheck, born Donald Eugene Lytle, began as Jones's bass player and backup singer. He worshipped George, mimicking his phrasing and stage presence until people called him Jones's shadow. To the outside world, it looked like a brotherhood. But Jones saw more than talent in Paycheck. He saw his own reflection, and it terrified him. As Paycheck stepped into the spotlight with outlaw anthems like "Take This Job and Shove It," his life quickly unraveled. Bar fights, cocaine binges, arrests, and a prison sentence for shooting a man. Paycheck's demons took control. For Jones, watching it all unfold was like watching a slow-motion replay of his own worst days. Their friendship was scarred by missed shows, broken promises, and the chaos that addiction always brings. Jones, who had barely crawled back from his own abyss, felt powerless to stop him. Yet he never turned his back. When Paycheck's legal troubles and failing health left him penniless, Jones shocked the industry by standing in front of cameras at his own home, publicly declaring support for a man everyone else had abandoned. And when Paycheck died in 2003, broke and forgotten, Jones stepped in again, this time to quietly pay for the funeral. Later, when asked about their complicated bond, Jones whispered the only words that mattered. "I loved Johnny Paycheck and wished I could have helped him more." It wasn't hate, it was sorrow. A sorrow so deep it cut sharper than any feud. Their story proved that sometimes the people who frustrate us the most are also the ones we love the hardest. If George Jones had one man to thank for saving his career in the late 1970s, it was producer Billy Sherrill. And yet, deep down, Jones could barely stomach him. Sherrill was a perfectionist, a mastermind of the polished countrypolitan sound that layered strings, choirs, and glossy production over country's raw core. He had worked wonders for Tammy Wynette and Charlie Rich. And when Jones's life spiraled into chaos, drugs, alcohol, missed shows, Sherrill was tasked with salvaging what was left. Out of that turbulent partnership came "He Stopped Loving Her Today," hailed as the greatest country song of all time. But Jones hated it. He scoffed at the lyrics, mocking its morbid theme, sneering, "Nobody will buy that morbid son of a bitch." Recording it was a nightmare. Sessions dragged on for over a year, with Jones slurring words, missing cues, or not showing up at all. Sherrill stitched the song together piece by piece, coaxing Jones into finishing it. The irony was brutal. The song Jones despised became the cornerstone of his legacy. But the victory was bittersweet. Jones resented the lush production, the heavy strings, the choir backing. To him, it felt like betrayal, his honky-tonk soul being dressed up for mass-market consumption. He bristled at Sherrill's control, hating how the producer demanded order from a man who lived on chaos. Cheryl admitted later that working with Jones was like taming a hurricane, and even he confessed, "I hated that too." Yet together they made magic, a sound neither could have achieved alone. To the public, it looked like triumph. Behind the scenes, it was war, a constant push and pull between tradition and reinvention, between a singer who lived by instinct and a producer who worshipped structure. And though Jones never denied Cheryl's role in reviving his career, he carried a quiet bitterness until his death. For George, survival had come at a cost. His greatest masterpiece was born out of a partnership he could barely endure. Few stories capture the chaos of George Jones's darkest years better than the night he stumbled, drunk and disoriented, into Waylon Jennings's house. It was the 1970s, when both men were battling demons, but George's spiral was something no one could control. Uninvited, barely able to stand, Jones barged into Waylon's home, shouting nonsense, knocking things over, and finally swinging at Jennings himself. Waylon, who wasn't exactly known for patience, had seen plenty of wild nights, but this was different. With the help of his wife, Jessie Coulter, and others in the house, Jennings did something unthinkable. He tied George Jones to the floor. Not out of cruelty, but pure exasperation. Even in the outlaw world, where excess and rebellion were badges of honor, George's behavior had become unbearable. The moment said it all. If Waylon Jennings, the man who lived on the edge, had to physically restrain you, you were truly out of control. And yet, what might have destroyed a lesser friendship became, over time, a story they laughed about. Jennings joked later that trying to manage Jones was like wrestling a greased hog, while George, once sober, would chuckle about the insanity of it all. Their clash wasn't born from rivalry or jealousy. Both were giants of their own style. Waylon leading the outlaw rebellion, Jones carrying the torch of pure honky-tonk heartbreak. What tied them together wasn't competition, but addiction. The battlefield they both knew too well. That night on the floor was a symbol of how far Jones had fallen, a man so consumed by alcohol that even his friends couldn't trust him to stand on his own 2 feet. But it was also proof of the strange loyalty that bound country's wildest men together. They fought, they drank, they destroyed, but when the dust settled, they forgave. For Jones and Jennings, it wasn't hate that defined their story, but survival in a world where both nearly lost everything. If there was ever a man George Jones respected, it was Merle Haggard. Haggard once called him the greatest country singer who ever lived. And when they sang together, the harmony was almost spiritual. But admiration wasn't enough to erase the chaos that followed Jones everywhere he went. Their big break as a duo came in the early 1980s when they planned a joint tour that had fans salivating. On paper, it was country royalty united. In reality, it was a nightmare. George simply wouldn't show up. Sometimes he was late, sometimes drunk, sometimes gone altogether. For Haggard, who prided himself on professionalism, it was infuriating. He later admitted bluntly, "George would rather be drunk than be a superstar." Those words stung, but they were true. Jones's unreliability wrecked schedules, drained energy, and tested the patience of everyone around him. Still, Merle never truly abandoned him. Maybe it was empathy. Haggard had served prison time, battled drugs, and carried scars of his own. He knew broken men because he had been one. He saw that Jones's genius and his destruction came from the same well. And so their bond endured, battered but unbroken. Decades later, in 2006, long after Jones sobered up, they reunited for the album Kickin' Out the Footlights. Again, the project was more than nostalgia. It was a quiet reconciliation. Each man covered the other's songs, trading verses like old friends finally at peace. In the liner notes, Haggard reflected not with anger, but with awe. "There was nobody like George," he said, "and there never will be." Still, he never sugarcoated the past. Being close to Jones during the height of his addiction was, in his own words, a nightmare, even for those who loved him. Their story was one of country music's strangest contradictions, a friendship defined by respect, poisoned by chaos, and redeemed by time. George Jones drove Merle Haggard to rage, but he also inspired him, and in the end, that inspiration won. By the 1990s, country music was no longer the same world George Jones had built his life upon. What had once been songs of sorrow sung in dimly lit honky-tonks was now a spectacle played out under blinding lights before tens of thousands of screaming fans. At the center of this transformation stood one man, Garth Brooks, with headset microphones strapped across his face, fire cannons bursting behind him, and the swagger of a rock star. Brooks turned country into something larger than life. His concerts resembled Super Bowl halftime shows, complete with choreography, pyrotechnics, and the kind of energy more at home in an arena rock concert than the Grand Ole Opry. To millions, Brooks was a revolution, the man who carried country into the modern era. To George Jones, he was the symbol of everything slipping away. Jones believed country music was sacred. It was not about flash or fame, but about the ache in a man's chest when he lost the woman he loved, about the desperation of a broken promise, about loneliness sung so honestly it hurt. He believed country belonged to the poor man's heart, not to MTV, not to headset microphones, not to stadium tours where the show mattered more than the song. Watching Brooks rise to superstardom was, for George, like watching his own reflection fade from the mirror. He knew his time was being pushed aside, and it stung. In interviews throughout the 1990s, Jones never openly declared war on Brooks by name, but his criticisms drew a bullseye around him. "They're turning country into something I don't recognize anymore," Jones said bluntly in one Rolling Stone interview. "It's more about the show than the song." To him, Brooks's spectacle was the very erosion of country's soul. Yet the deepest wound wasn't the concerts, the lights, or even the millions of albums sold. It was an act meant to honor him that became a source of humiliation. Brooks recorded a heartfelt tribute song called George Jones, a gesture of respect from the biggest star of the era to the man who had inspired him. But when Brooks's label, Capitol Records, reviewed it, they refused to release it commercially. Their reason was simple but devastating. George Jones's name and sound were not radio-friendly. To Jones, this was more than business. It was rejection. The system that he had given his life to now deemed him unfit for the very airwaves he once dominated. It was a symbolic slap in the face, proof that in Nashville's eyes, he was no longer relevant. He carried the hurt quietly, but it never left him. Though George rarely attacked Brooks personally, he made no secret of his resentment toward the industry that celebrated Brooks while burying the old guard. He saw himself, Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzle, and every pioneer of the genre being pushed aside for flash and youth. To him, Brooks wasn't the villain, but the chosen face of a system that no longer respected its elders. Still, Brooks never returned bitterness. He always spoke of Jones as one of his heroes, often citing him as the reason he sang in the first place. And when George died in 2013, Brooks paid tribute with genuine emotion, mourning the man who had inspired him even as their worlds had never truly met. In the end, their divide was not personal, it was generational. Jones represented the raw soul of country, while Brooks represented its reinvention for a new age. The conflict between them was the conflict within country itself. Tradition versus transformation. Roots versus reinvention. Storytelling versus spectacle. For George Jones, Garth Brooks was not an enemy, but a symbol, a reminder of what country music was becoming, and of the painful truth that the world he had once ruled would never return. And in that realization, perhaps more than in any feud with a single person, lay the deepest hurt of all. Of all George Jones's complicated relationships, none cut deeper than his marriage to Tammy Wynette. To fans, they were country's golden couple. Their duets like Golden Ring and We're Gonna Hold On, painting a picture of unshakable devotion. On stage, their voices melted into harmony so perfect it seemed divinely ordained. But off stage, the harmony collapsed into chaos. Jones's drinking, drug use, and violent mood swings turned their home into a battlefield. Tammy, dubbed the First Lady of Country Music, endured years of turmoil, frequent disappearances, drunken rages, and terrifying unpredictability. By 1975, the marriage was shattered, but the scars would last a lifetime. In 1979, Tammy detonated a bombshell, her autobiography, Stand By Your Man. In its pages, she accused Jones of abuse, claiming he once chased her through their house with a loaded rifle. Fans were stunned. George was humiliated. In his own 1996 memoir, I Lived to Tell It All, Jones struck back, denying the worst allegations and accusing Tammy of exaggeration, even fabrication. She made it all sound worse than it was, he wrote, wounded by what he saw as a betrayal from the woman he had once adored. For George, the book wasn't just words. It was a stain on his name, a condemnation that haunted him for decades. Their professional bond, however, refused to die. In the 1990s, long after the divorce, they reunited musically for the album One, singing songs drenched in irony and memory. To the public, it looked like reconciliation, but insiders knew the peace was fragile. The affection was real, yet the wounds ran deep. When Tammy died in 1998, George broke down in tears at her funeral, admitting a piece of him had died with her. For all the bitterness, there was also love, complicated, destructive, but undeniable. Their story was never about simple hatred. It was about two people bound by music, torn apart by demons, and forever linked by a love that refused to vanish, even in death. By the late 1990s, George Jones had outlived most of his demons and earned the right to rest on his legend. But instead of reverence, he felt pushed aside by the very industry he helped build. Nashville was chasing younger stars, slicker sounds, and bigger profits, while the pioneers who carved the path were treated like relics. Jones's resentment toward the establishment boiled quietly for years, but in 1999, it erupted in a way the world could not ignore. That year, Jones released Choices, a searing ballad about addiction, regret, and survival. It was his story in 3 minutes, raw, unvarnished, and more personal than anything he'd sung in decades. Critics hailed it as one of his finest late-career works, a song that cut straight to the bone. When the Country Music Association invited him to perform at the CMA Awards, it should have been a crowning moment. Instead, they insulted him. The CMA told Jones he could sing, but only a shortened version. For George, it was unthinkable. To cut down Choices, a song born from years of pain and redemption, was to gut its very soul. He refused. Outraged, he boycotted the ceremony. "They want George Jones to show up and smile," he said bitterly. "But they don't want to hear George Jones sing." It wasn't just about one song. To Jones, it symbolized everything wrong with the industry. Country music's heart, its pain, its honesty, its storytelling, was being sacrificed for ratings and spectacle. His boycott was a protest not just for himself, but for every traditional artist Nashville had discarded. And then came the moment that etched itself into country music history. Midway through his scheduled performance at the CMAs, Alan Jackson stopped singing his own hit, Papa Top. With a defiant wave to his band, he shifted gears, launching instead into the chorus of Choices. The crowd gasped, then roared. It was a rebellion live on television, a bold tribute to George Jones that no one could cut short. Watching from home, Jones wept. For once, someone in Nashville had stood up for him, not with words, but with music. The incident left its mark. Jones remained bitter toward the industry's treatment of its elders, but Alan Jackson's act proved that the old guard still had defenders. To George, the snub confirmed his worst fears about Nashville's direction, but the protest reminded him that his voice, and what it stood for, still mattered. The CMA controversy became a defining symbol of his later years. George Jones versus the establishment, the soul of country against the machinery of profit. When the curtain finally fell on George Jones's life in 2013, the world remembered the voice, the songs, and the man who could make even the toughest hearts break with a single line. But behind that unforgettable sound was a lifetime of scars and grudges, frustrations that stretched from personal betrayals to the very industry he helped define. His clashes weren't about petty jealousy. They were born from the same fire that made him great: his refusal to bend, his unwillingness to let anyone dilute the soul of country music. Johnny Paycheck reminded him of his own demons, a mirror of chaos and destruction that ended in tragedy. Billy Sherrill gave him his greatest masterpiece, but at the cost of a sound George never fully embraced. Waylon Jennings tied him to the floor, proof of how far his addiction had taken him, but also proof that even the wildest outlaw could not break their strange bond. Merle Haggard loved him, respected him, but cursed his unreliability. Garth Brooks symbolized a new age George could never recognize, a future that left him feeling abandoned. Tammy Wynette gave him love, pain, betrayal, and a wound that never truly healed, even as death brought forgiveness. And Nashville's establishment, the machinery of money and power, proved to be his greatest enemy of all, stripping away respect from the very man who had poured his blood into the music. Yet through all of this, one truth stands tall. George Jones never stopped being George Jones. He never bowed to trends, never chased what was easy, never surrendered the raw honesty that defined him. Even in his resentments, there was love. Love for music, love for truth, and love for the purity of the genre he guarded like a soldier. When Alan Jackson sang Choices on live television, the crowd may have cheered for the song, but in that moment, they were really cheering for the man who had lived every word of it. His legacy is not just in the records, not just in the awards, but in the way his voice continues to haunt anyone who hears it. He carried bitterness, yes, but also passion. He clashed with friends, yes, but also inspired them. And though he walked through decades of heartbreak and disappointment, his songs outlived the feuds, the scandals, and the pain. In the end, George Jones stood for something larger than himself. He stood for country music's soul, the reminder that at its best, it isn't about light shows or arenas, it's about the truth of being human. And that is why, no matter who he couldn't stand, the world will forever stand by George Jones.